The Star Tiger, January 30th, 1948. A British South American Airways Tudor 4-passenger plane lifted off from the Azores, carrying 25 passengers and 6 crew members across the Atlantic toward Bermuda. The flight had already been delayed by mechanical problems. The weather reports warned of strong headwinds, but the captain, Brian Macmillan, was experienced, methodical, and confident. He adjusted his altitude to 2,000 feet to stay below the worst of the winds. He radioed his position. Everything was normal. Then, somewhere over the open ocean, less than 400 miles from Bermuda, the Star Tiger simply stopped existing. No mayday, no distress call, no wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies. The search covered over 250,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing, not a seat cushion, not a life vest, not a single piece of debris. The official investigation concluded with a sentence that has haunted aviation historians ever since. The fate of the Star Tiger must remain an unsolved mystery, but this was only the first time those exact words would appear in a British government report. The Star Aerial. 11 months later, on January 17th, 1949, a sister aircraft from the same airline, the same Tudor 4 model, took off from Bermuda heading to Jamaica. Clear skies, smooth conditions. Captain John McPhee radioed in at 9:32 a.m. with a routine update. He sounded completely calm. He mentioned the weather was excellent. He gave his coordinates. Then nothing. Search planes were launched within hours. The U.S. Navy joined. Aircraft carriers were diverted. The search zone was enormous. The weather was ideal for visibility, and the ocean was calm. They searched for 6 days. They found absolutely nothing. 2 identical planes from the same airline on nearly identical routes vanished in the same general region without leaving behind a single trace. Tudor 4s were grounded permanently. The phrase Bermuda Triangle hadn't been invented yet, but the foundations of the legend were being quietly laid down in classified British aviation files. Flight 19, December 5th, 1945. 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for a routine training flight. The leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, was a combat veteran with thousands of flight hours. 90 minutes into the exercise, something began to go wrong. Taylor radioed that both of his compasses had failed. He said he didn't know where he was. The transmissions that followed became increasingly disoriented. He believed they were over the Florida Keys when they were actually over the Bahamas. He turned the formation in the wrong direction. As fuel ran low and the sun began to set, the radio chatter grew tense. One of the last transmissions, picked up faintly through the static, was reportedly a pilot saying, "We can't tell which way is west. Everything is wrong. Strange." A massive rescue mission was launched. A PBM Mariner flying boat with 13 crew members took off to search for them. 20 minutes later, that plane also disappeared. A passing tanker reported seeing a fireball over the ocean around the same time, though the connection has never been definitively confirmed. 6 aircraft, 27 men, gone. The Navy's final report used a phrase that became infamous, as if they had flown to Mars. The Glenn Miller disappearance, December 15th, 1944. The most famous band leader in America boarded a small UC-64 Norseman aircraft at an airfield in Bedfordshire, England. He was scheduled to fly to Paris to perform for Allied troops. The weather was awful. Fog hung thick over the channel. Visibility was almost zero. The pilot, John Morgan, had limited instrument flying experience. Miller reportedly made a nervous joke before boarding, asking where the parachutes were. The plane took off. It never arrived in Paris. There was no distress call, no debris, no confirmed crash site. For decades, theories swirled. Some said the plane iced up and went down silently into the freezing channel. Others suggested it was accidentally struck by jettisoned bombs from returning Allied aircraft offloading their payload over a designated dump zone. One British navigator claimed he saw a small plane fitting the description spinning down into the water below him, but no wreckage was ever recovered, no body, nothing to confirm any theory. One of the most recognizable musicians of the 20th century simply ceased to exist somewhere over grey water on a foggy afternoon, and to this day no one knows exactly where he came to rest. The Stardust, August 2nd, 1947. A British South American Airways Lancastrian airliner approached Santiago, Chile, after a long flight over the Andes. The crew radioed the tower with their final transmission, ETA Santiago 1745 hours Stendek. The word Stendek was repeated twice. The radio operator at Santiago asked them to clarify. The crew repeated it again, then silence. The plane never landed. Search parties scoured the Andes for weeks. They found nothing. The mystery of the word Stendek haunted aviation enthusiasts for over 50 years. Was it code? A garbled distress signal? An anagram? Some kind of warning? Theories multiplied wildly. Then, in 1998, two Argentine mountain climbers found a Rolls-Royce engine sticking out of a glacier high in the Andes. The Stardust had crashed into Mount Tupungato and been buried under decades of slow-moving ice. The plane had likely hit the mountain in a whiteout, but the meaning of Stendek was never officially solved. Linguists, cryptographers, and aviation experts have proposed theories for decades. None have ever been confirmed. The plane was found, the word never was. Amelia Earhart's final flight, July 2nd, 1937. Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan took off from Lae, New Guinea, in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra, attempting the longest and most dangerous leg of their around-the-world flight. Their destination was Howland Island, a tiny strip of land barely visible in the vast Pacific. A U.S. Coast Guard ship, the Itasca, was stationed near the island to guide them in. The radio transmissions from Earhart grew increasingly desperate. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low." Then fainter. "We are running north and south." Then nothing. The largest search and rescue operation in U.S. naval history began. 9 ships, 66 aircraft. They covered hundreds of thousands of square miles of empty Pacific. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies. Theories have consumed researchers for almost 90 years. Did she crash into the ocean and sink? Did she land on the uninhabited Nikumaroro Island and die as a castaway? Was she captured by the Japanese? In recent years, bone fragments and artifacts found on Nikumaroro have reignited that theory, but no remains have ever been positively identified as hers. Nearly a century later, one of the most famous women in the world is still missing. Varig Flight 967, January 30th, 1979. A Brazilian Varig cargo plane, a Boeing 707, took off from Tokyo's Narita Airport, headed for Rio de Janeiro. It was carrying 6 crew members and a cargo of 153 paintings by Japanese-Brazilian artist Manabu Mabe, valued at over $1 million. 30 minutes into the flight, the plane disappeared from radar over the Pacific Ocean. There was no distress call. The weather was clear. The plane was in excellent condition. A massive search was launched, covering vast stretches of ocean. They found absolutely nothing. Not a piece of fuselage, not a fragment of a painting, not a single body. This wasn't 1948 or 1944. This was 1979. Radar technology, communications, search infrastructure had all advanced enormously. And still, a Boeing 707 carrying 6 people and over 100 priceless paintings vanished into the Pacific and left no evidence behind. The disappearance has never been explained. The paintings, presumed lost, have never surfaced anywhere in the world. The Frederick Valentich disappearance, October 21st, 1978. A 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich was flying a Cessna 182 over the Bass Strait in southern Australia. The night was clear. The flight was routine. Then he radioed Melbourne Air Traffic Control with something strange. He said there was an aircraft above him that wouldn't identify itself. He described it as long, metallic, with a green light, traveling at incredible speed. The controller asked him to clarify what type of aircraft it was. Valentich's response has become one of the most chilling exchanges in aviation history. "It isn't an aircraft." 17 seconds of silence followed. Then a strange metallic scraping sound was recorded over the radio. Then the transmission ended. Valentich, his Cessna, and any trace of either were never found. The Australian Department of Transport investigation officially concluded that the cause of the disappearance was unknown. Theories range from disorientation, suicide, fuel exhaustion, and pilot inexperience to something far stranger that he himself seemed to be describing in real time. Whatever the truth, his final words, captured on tape, remain one of the most haunting recordings ever made by a missing pilot. Pan Am Flight 7, November 8, 1957. A Boeing Stratocruiser took off from San Francisco, beginning a luxurious round-the-world journey. 44 people were on board. The flight was supposed to land in Honolulu in just under 9 hours. Somewhere over the Pacific, it disappeared. There was no distress call, no mechanical warning. The plane simply stopped responding. 6 days later, a Navy ship found floating debris and bodies. Autopsies revealed something deeply unsettling. The passengers had elevated levels of carbon monoxide in their blood. The watches on the bodies had stopped at different times, suggesting they had died before the crash. Investigators considered a fire, a deliberate act, even murder, but no conclusive cause was ever determined. The FBI got involved. Theories of sabotage, suicide, and insurance fraud swirled around several passengers, but nothing was ever proven. The flight had been carrying a former FBI agent. It had also been carrying a man with an enormous life insurance policy taken out just before the flight. The investigation closed without an answer. Officially, no one knows what happened to Pan Am Flight 7. Malaysia Airlines Flight 37, March 8, 2014. A Boeing 777 with 239 people on board took off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. 38 minutes into the flight, the co-pilot transmitted his final words, "Good night, Malaysian 370. Then the transponder switched off. Then the plane vanished from civilian radar, but military radar tracked something unexpected. The aircraft turned. It turned hard, away from its planned route, and flew west across the Malay Peninsula, then north up the Strait of Malacca, then south into one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth. For 7 hours it flew, with no communication, on a path that made no logical sense. Then it ran out of fuel and went down somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. The search that followed was the most expensive and extensive aviation search in history. A few small pieces of debris washed up years later on beaches in Africa and on islands in the Indian Ocean, confirming the plane had crashed. But the main wreckage, the black boxes, and the remains of the 239 people on board have never been found. Was it a deliberate act by one of the pilots? A hijacking? A catastrophic fire that incapacitated the crew while the autopilot flew on? More than a decade later, with all the modern technology in the world, the most thoroughly investigated aviation mystery of the 21st century remains completely unsolved. The B-47 Stratojet, March 10, 1956. A U.S. Air Force B-47 bomber departed MacDill Air Force Base in Florida on a routine refueling mission across the Atlantic toward Morocco. There were 3 crew members on board, and, according to some declassified accounts, 2 capsules of nuclear weapons material. The plane completed its first aerial refueling without incident. As it descended through the clouds to meet a second refueling tanker over the Mediterranean, it disappeared. No mayday, no debris, no oil. The Air Force conducted an extensive search and found nothing. The crew was declared missing. The official record states that the plane and its sensitive cargo were never recovered. For decades, the Pentagon classified the details of what exactly was on board. A nuclear-armed bomber vanished into the sea with no wreckage, no explanation, and no recovery. It remains one of America's lost broken arrow incidents, an official Cold War term for nuclear weapons accidents. The plane is still somewhere on the floor of the Mediterranean, or it isn't. No one knows for sure. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, March the 16th, 1962. A Lockheed Super Constellation took off from Guam carrying 93 U.S. Army Rangers and a crew of 11. They were headed to the Philippines, then on to South Vietnam, in the early shadow days before the Vietnam War officially began. The plane reported its position normally. The weather was clear. Then it disappeared. A Liberian tanker in the area reported seeing a bright light explode in the sky. Investigators searched 144,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no bodies. The official investigation concluded that they could not determine the cause of the disappearance because no wreckage was ever recovered to examine. The families of the soldiers were told only that their loved ones were missing. Because the Vietnam War had not yet been officially declared, the names of those 93 Rangers were never added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Their families fought for decades for recognition. The cause of the explosion, if it was an explosion, was never determined. Sabotage was suspected. Nothing was ever proven. 107 people, on a secret mission to a war that hadn't started yet, vanished over the Pacific and left behind only a single eyewitness account of a fireball, a search of empty ocean, and a silence that has lasted more than 60 years.